So as we all know, shortly after the war started in Ukraine, there was a lot of discussion about how the West needed to provide massive new economic aid. It may have taken longer than some people had hoped at the start, but Ukraine did indeed sign a significant loan deal with the IMF in 2014, which was then revised in 2015. So what I wanted to do in this memo was to see whether this was any different from previous IMF deals, both in terms of content and in terms of implementation. And so in the next few minutes, I'm going to try to do three things. First, I will compare the content of this deal with earlier ones. I'll let you know now they're fairly similar to earlier deals. Second, I look at the political conditions for implementing the deal's requirements. Here it seems like in some ways they are better than in the past, and early returns on some aspects of the reforms are that they have gone better than you might have thought. But third, I point out that the program includes two types of reforms. The first is relatively technocratic, and although they seem to be difficult in some circumstances, in some conditions, they're fairly easy to implement. The second type, though, will be much more difficult, and I'm concerned that trying to achieve them just by getting tough or mustering political will, as is often the slogan, could actually be very destructive. So first, let's compare the IMF deals that Ukraine has had over the years. The 2015 agreement is the 10th one in the post-Soviet period, hence the title of the memo, 10th time's a charm, question mark. And the fact is they haven't changed all that much during that time. There was some transformation in the size of the loans over the course of the post-Soviet period, but that shift happened in 2008, which was, of course, the year of the global financial crash, right? Before 2008, the biggest IMF package for Ukraine was about $2.5 billion, and most of them were under $1 billion. In 2008, that amount jumped way up, all the way to $16.5 billion, but of course that had nothing to do with anything that later happened on Maidan. It was all about the global financial crash. All three agreements since 2008, there was one in 2010, one in 2014, and one this year, were roughly the same size as the 2008 agreement, $16 to $18 billion. So what this means is, yes, there was a lot of talk after the war about the need for a massive infusion from the West, but if you were looking for something unprecedented, you would have been disappointed in terms of size. If we look at the conditionality side of the agreements, we actually see even less change, I think. All of the programs, all the way back to the early 1990s, crystallized around liberalization, stabilization, and structural reform. Liberalization has always meant free prices, more open trade, and a free-floating exchange rate, and it still means that. Stabilization meant tightening monetary policy, tightening fiscal policy in order to bring inflation down and stabilize the currency, and it still means that. Structural reform actually usually receives less direct treatment in the program language than the other two categories, but it is the one that changes a little bit over time. But still, there is a lot of constant language in there as well, constant themes, many of them revolving around reducing corruption and increasing transparency. And that's, again, what the current program asks for. So in some ways, today's program is essentially the same one that the IMF has been recommending to Ukraine for over 20 years. So the question is, why should it work now, especially if the economic situation, if anything, is worse now than it was before the war? Well, if you were looking for a reason to be optimistic, you would probably point to political will among both the population and the leadership. We've heard some of this already in the first panel, but for one thing, the rally around the flag effect might very well be expected to make politicians and citizens more prepared to accept austerity policies than they would have been under other circumstances. For another, the at least temporary loss of Crimea and the eastern regions that Kyiv currently can't control has removed one axis of fragmentation in Ukrainian politics. I'm not arguing this is a good thing. I'm just saying that it changes what Kyiv can get done on economic policies right now. And so it might be easier for them to pass these sorts of things. And a third reason that commitment to IMF conditions might be higher now than in the past is because some of the administrators themselves are new. Right? It's obviously a risky strategy to bring in total outsiders, but you can bring in Yaresko at finance, you can bring in Saakashvili in Odessa, and at least you know they're not beholden to the old networks or the old policies. So maybe it's, again, a chance to get something new done. And the fact is, frankly, surprising to me, that over the last few months, Ukraine has made surprisingly good progress on the reforms from the perspective of the IMF. All right, month-on-month inflation has dropped way down. The hryvnia might have stabilized for now. I'm going to say how fragile these things might be in a minute, but they're there. The government actually underspent the plan in the first quarter of this year so that the deficit was lower than expected. Almost never see that, certainly in a war. And of course, the country was very recently able to renegotiate its public debt to private creditors in such a way that payments going forward may be more manageable. So a number of the quantitative macroeconomic indicators, which are the first focus of IMF programs, look quite good, especially for a country in the middle of a war, even if it's in a low right now. So does this mean that we are finally seeing the era of extraordinary politics in Ukraine that a lot of people were hoping for in the early 90s? Have the political conditions crystallized in such a way that they can pass a set of reforms that will rejuvenate the economy and satisfy a public demand for reform? Well, if austerity is your goal, then it certainly seems like it's been easier to get the votes and the popular tolerance for things like lower government spending, higher prices on natural gas at home, and higher interest rates. There are three, though, big reasons for caution, I think. The first two have to do with the fragility of what's occurred so far, but the third one, then, I think is even bigger than that. So first, the political unity we've seen might fade. We see evidence of cracks in unity already. The recent activities of Right Sector and Svoboda are worrying, although we might hope that those actually galvanize most of the population against those groups, and so perhaps unity will be sustained. The second reason, though, to be concerned is that several factors that are beyond the government's control, like the course of the war or what happens with global commodity prices, might turn against Ukraine in the future and undermine what has been done on these macroeconomic policies. But most important, though, I think, is that the next steps are more difficult. Even if what has already been done sticks, right? If we're honest, there weren't a whole lot of people on the Maidan clamoring for higher natural gas prices at home or for higher interest rates from the central bank. What they wanted was to end corruption, to remove oligarchs from politics, to create some sort of broad-based economic growth that would benefit most of the population. The problem is we don't really know how to do that. In fact, ending corruption and ridding the country of oligarchs, I think, is frankly impossible. Not because of anything that's characteristic to Ukraine, but because we don't see it anywhere else either. Jeffrey Winters, I think, has done us a big favor by emphasizing that oligarchy is a persistent characteristic of civilization. As long as you have desirable assets and coercive tools available in the same place, somebody will be able to take some of those assets and protect them. Furthermore, we find corruption, often significant corruption, in every political economy in the world. Now, both oligarchies and corruption take different forms in different places, and I think that's what will prove to be important. But if we try to emphasize eliminating or reducing on some sort of linear scale these activities rather than transforming them, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment at best and unnecessary violence and coercion at worst. It's a complicated task that we don't understand very well to transform these processes, which means I think it's not the kind of thing that can be fixed simply with more political will. So in my last 20 seconds, I do think that in some ways, yes, the 10th time has been a charm. Ukraine has had the greatest reform success that could have been hoped for if we define success in IMF terms. Unfortunately, I also think that all the drama that's occurred so far around economic reforms in the country has actually been the easy part. And everything from here on out gets more difficult, probably in ways we don't understand yet. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. Our next speaker is Yuriy Matsiyevsky from Ostroh Academy National University in Ukraine.
Thank you. Looking at the time frames that we have, I will limit my presentation to several points, and I will probably start with the major one, which is follow-up to what was already said in this room. The major issue with Ukraine is the reforms, and in order to make Ukraine a successful case in reform, Ukraine needs to be tightened to the Western institutions and structures. And why Ukraine should be matter for the West? For several reasons. And this is economic reason, and first of all, this is security reason, because if Ukraine would be left aside, we could have a major security problem here in Eurasia, considering the war which is going on the ground, considering the potential influx of refugees to European countries if the war will continue and it will be going on, and looking for geopolitical concerns. If Ukraine will be a stable country, the situation in the whole nexus from the Baltic to Black Sea will be stable, which will be benefit to all. So, and even from the economic terms, if Ukraine will be stable, it is a huge market, underinvested market, and for all this reason, not to say the least one, the last but not the least, is a moral ground issue. The West owes something to Ukraine, because Ukraine given up 1,200 nuclear warheads, signing Budapest Memorandum in 1994, and the memorandum doesn't work, meaning that this so-called security assurances meant nothing when Ukraine has to confront Russia last year. So considering all this issue, Ukraine becomes a focal point for the West. But the problem is that the West were more focused on Russia, not on Ukraine, because Russia were posing the major threat for the whole system of international relations and the whole system of security. And in that relations with the Russia, Ukraine were treated as a function in developing of the EU and the US foreign policy. And from that perspective, it's a bad luck for Ukraine that you had a conflict there. So changing focus is not an easy thing, because this machinery of the state administration and the EU and bureaucracy, they are operating in some frames, and that was already, Andrew was saying, this conditionality policy. This is, if you achieve something, we could give you more for opening a door and opening the process for integration. And that's it. This is a unique opportunity for the West to change its focus, and this changing of focus should be done in another level. Instead of focusing on the leadership, the Western policy community and the expert community should focus on those who are drivers of reforms in Ukraine. And this is the people on the ground, this is the civic activists. Because in Ukraine we have a spurt of civic activism, and I believe our colleagues in this session will talk more about the drivers of reforms. So changing these two perspectives, prioritizing Ukraine and prioritizing civic activists in Ukraine, could help Ukraine bring closer to the Western institutions. And what form could be this? What kind of tightening, anchoring Ukraine to this Western institution could be? This could be a developing of existing frameworks and structures. So we have, for example, a partnership agreement, strategic partnership with the United States, which is not working well, because this strategic relations gave nothing to Ukraine, actually. We have on the other side EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, which will come into effect fully beginning in the January 1st next year. So, but it's not enough. And what kind of tightening could be here? One project which is just recently been in discussion is creating so-called federation or confederation of states from Baltic to Black Sea. This is so-called intermarium project. This is the biggest geopolitical idea, but this idea has roots in 20s of the 20th century, when the Polish President Pilsudski first came to discuss this issue. But in that time, Poland were in a similar situation as Ukraine now. And then, because of France, Germany, and other European countries, this project has not succeeded. Now Poland is interested because newly elected President Duda in Poland, he was talking about this idea. And in Ukrainian expert community, this idea is discussing. So it was exploring further to help those people interested in having Ukraine tighten closer in in this sort of structures, that would solve many issues. That will solve the issue of security, economic reforms, stabilization, and instead of looking for the short-time political or economic stabilization, the Western political community would better focus on long-term institution building, because what is the problem in Ukraine? That we have a state which is weak, but we have a society which is well and alive. And the traditional view of Ukraine could be either it is a bad story or it is a good story, depending on perspective what you have. If you are having bright glasses, you will see in Ukraine young democracy aspiring for entering the EU and NATO. But if you have somewhat dark glasses, you will see corrupt and ineffective state. And depending on perspective, you will see one or two or the other picture, but the picture is much more complex. So operating in one or the opposite frame will not help solving Ukrainian problems. We have to look broader, and my message here, thank you, my message here is to change the focus. Start looking at those who are the drivers of reforms, and if we have a broader look, start looking on prioritizing Ukraine over Greece, for example, over Russia as a major threat. So that would be helpful for Ukraine, and that would be helpful for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuriy. Next, we have Robert Orttung of George Washington University, and he will be speaking about his memo, Can Ukraine Effectively Fight Corruption?
So thank you very much for the introduction. I want to quickly jump into this topic, and what I had to say will follow on very well with what Andrew and Yuriy have already said. And so in addressing the question, can Ukraine effectively fight, can you hear? No. Addressing the question, can Ukraine effectively fight corruption, I want to first give a quick picture of the current situation, then spend 2 seconds discussing what ideally should be the situation, and then spend about 5 minutes looking at what's actually happening on the ground. So if you look at the situation with corruption since the revolution in 2014, it's a very mixed picture. On one hand, the government has made unprecedented progress compared to previous governments in Ukraine in fighting corruption. We have a new National Anti-Corruption Bureau has been established. It's in the process of being set up right now. There's been some progress in terms of the energy system, in terms of raising prices, as Andrew mentioned. We've heard about the police reforms earlier this morning in several of the cities, which have been effective. There's also been a large influx of foreigners bringing new ideas into the Ukrainian government. This is all seen as relatively successful activities. At the same time, civil society has become much more active in Ukrainian life, and in contrast to the period after the Orange Revolution, civil society groups realize they need to stay actively involved in pressuring the government to keep making reforms. So that's a new thing, and you have a lot of NGOs have been set up. The Anti-Corruption Action Center and groups like Transparency International are quite effective, and the oddly named reanimation package reforms, which has also played a big role despite the awkward designation of it. And also you have lots of media reports on corruption in Ukraine. So that's giving people full information about what's going on. But at the same time, as we've heard, many people are unhappy about the pace of reform, and many people think that not enough is happening now, and that in general the situation hasn't really changed. So you have a very mixed picture. On one hand, there has been some progress. On the other hand, it's definitely not enough to make most people happy. So what I want to do is look at the situation there, and the main argument that I want to make in the next 8 minutes, and this is a project I'm working on with Irina Olympieva, who's my colleague from St. Petersburg, but looking at the relationship between the state, the civil society, the media, and the general public. And so I want to show how it works. So ideally, you would have a strong relationship between the NGOs and the state, that all these activated people from the Maidan would have an influence on what happens with the state. And at the same time, you'd have a very strong relationship between the NGOs and the general public, working through the media, working directly with the population, and you'd have the same sort of relationship by the president, mostly through the media, working directly with the people, and then you'd have feelings of trust from the population toward these institutions. However, if you look at what's going on, there's not really a strong relationship between the NGOs today and the state. So this connection has sort of been broken. So on one hand, much of the legislation that you have in Ukraine fighting corruption was actually written by civil society groups and introduced into the parliament in October of last year, but that legislation has been very poorly implemented. Like the new National Anti-Corruption Bureau hasn't really been set up yet, it's not actually working, and it's not clear that it will be effective because it doesn't have any prosecutorial power. So it can investigate cases of corruption among high-level officials in Ukraine, but it can't prosecute them, and that's going to require a whole reform of the prosecutor's office, which is also happening very slowly. So the other problem is that there's very little connection between the NGOs that exist in Kyiv and in some of the cities outside and the actual population. So we did some focus group studies asking people if they'd heard of these NGOs, and in most cases they had never heard of the main NGOs that are fighting corruption. So there's sort of a general feeling that we need to fight corruption. The people who are actually doing it are not very well connected with the mass public, so there's a break there. And then unfortunately, that leads to a lot of unhappiness from the public's perspective of what's going on in the state. And so then you have a lot of media reports of what's going on. The media in Ukraine, obviously, sort of half owned by oligarchs, half owned by other structures, but you have a relatively pluralistic media, so you have lots of information available. It's not a completely controlled information space. But the result is that the media is providing lots of information about corruption that's going on in Ukrainian society, and that's being absorbed by the public, but the public doesn't see any response. And so instead of, everybody knows what's going on, everybody knows where the corruption is, they don't see that anyone's doing anything about it necessarily. So that creates a lot of frustration and apathy. And so that creates more anger toward the NGOs, more anger toward the president. So given this big mess, where we think the answer lies, and in contrast sort of to what Andrew was saying, it's a matter of political will. And that for the system to work, the person at the top, obviously Poroshenko, has to express more political will to get these things activated. And so people like to toss around this word, two words, political will. And so what we've been trying to do is figure out what exactly that means. And I think in very concrete terms, it means making the anti-corruption battle the #1 thing that he's focused on, even more important than the war. And #2, it means being able to build a coalition of forces so that can fight corruption. So whether it includes some oligarchs at the moment or not, that's another question we could discuss. So that's what needs to be done more effectively. And so what you have now, unfortunately, is that Poroshenko is sending very contradictory signals to society. On one hand, he himself is an oligarch and has a lot of connections into the old system. He's not really changing the system per se in Ukraine. On the other hand, he has done a lot of things that I've listed before, and also appointed Saakashvili. So I think what's effective about Saakashvili in this system is that he's actually expressing political will. And it's almost like Poroshenko sort of outsourced the need to express political will to Saakashvili. And Saakashvili is actually using this system very effectively. He is trying to do something in Odessa. It doesn't necessarily work. He runs into problems at the federal level. So he starts complaining about it to the media. That puts a lot of public pressure on the federal government, and that starts to make a little bit of change. So the one guy who does seem to be making this whole system work more or less effectively, regardless of whether he has ambitions to a higher level or not, he does seem to have the energy and the sense of how to make this system function. So just to conclude, I have one last thing. The main takeaway of the analysis is that the key to making an effective anti-corruption battle in Ukraine is that you have to have the bits and pieces working together, because the bits and pieces are all working on their own. There has been reform, civil society is activated, the media is doing a lot of investigations, public is paying attention, but they're not actually working together now. And so the trick is to make the interactions function better. And the best way to do that is that the leadership is going to have to come from the president. He's going to have to define what needs to be done, and then that's going to bring the other forces into the fight. So let me leave it at that.
Thank you, Bob. I'd like to thank everybody for sticking to the tight timetable so far. Next, we have a talk by Oxana Shevel of Tufts University, who will be speaking on decommunization in post-Euromaidan Ukraine.
Thank you. Let me just get this going. Okay. So what I wanted to do today, I wanted to take a look at the first consequences of the implementation of the legislation that became known as decommunization laws. So this package of 4 laws that were adopted by the Ukrainian parliament in April of this year and signed by the president the following month. So the laws entered into force at the end of May. And these are the 4 laws that were adopted. I am going to specifically focus on the consequences of the last law that is called on condemning the communist and national socialist Nazi totalitarian regimes and prohibiting propaganda of their symbols, because this is the law arguably with the most immediate and most practical consequences, because one of the elements of this law was the mandatory removal of monuments associated with the communist rule in Ukraine and communist leaders. The law set a specific timeline, basically saying that the localities have up until November of this year to decide how to rename into, what new names to come up with for these localities, for the names that were essentially outlawed. So the process really has gotten underway, and we can begin to assess the consequences of these laws. So just to kind of put it in a little bit broader context, so what I'm going to talk about is really just a small part of potential consequences and potential problems with these laws. Much ink has been spilled, and I don't mean it in a kind of sarcastic way. I think there were sound criticisms voiced about this package of decommunization laws and possible negative consequences that they might produce, in particular about threatening open historical debate and a discussion, including historical research, that because the laws essentially criminalize, in case of the last law on the communist and Nazi propaganda, certain public expression of certain opinions on these parts of Ukrainian history. There are also criticism raised about this law on the fighters, so-called fighters for Ukraine's independence, the questionable nature of some organizations, the radical nationalist organizations from the interwar period that were included on the list, and again, the illegality of expressing disrespectful attitudes to members of these organizations. Additional concerns were expressed about the costs, the large cost of renaming hundreds of localities. So all of these things are important, but I'm not going to be talking about them. What specifically I want to address is this criticism, in the set of criticisms of the law, one concern that was expressed is that these laws have a potential to deepen societal divisions between regions of Ukraine, essentially the argument being that this decommunization drive is going to have much less support and more opposition in the south and east of Ukraine, and at the time when Ukraine is essentially at war with Russia and has territorial problems, is it really a wise thing? Like, would polarization in the society deepen further? And what I wanted to suggest, based on my observations, and I'm going to talk about the kind of evidence I relied on, that this last concern may have been a little bit exaggerated. So in other words, yes, the laws are problematic in these other ways that I'm not talking about in my remarks, although I'm happy to address it in Q&A. But this specific issue of the deepening societal divisions, we actually, I would argue, don't really see that much. And here there is an interesting paradox. This is, by the way, just a map to show you where Lenin statues have fallen, this phenomenon known as Leninapad, the falling Lenins. And you can see it's actually quite interesting, right? The west of the country is not affected, and that's because Lenin statues have been removed there, in the early years of independence. However, from the fall of this main monument to Lenin in the Kyiv city during Euromaidan protests, and then up until September last year, so it's actually before the decommunization laws were adopted, we see this Leninapad really affecting the central Ukrainian regions, right? And to some part, the southern region, and much less in the east, right? So again, sort of this idea that there would be greater polarization, but from this mandatory removal of the monuments, there is something to it. This is the map from the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory that has been spearheading this whole decommunization process. They identified almost 1,000. This map is being updated all the time. At the time when I wrote my memo, I think by their count it was more like 877. Now it's 908. So this number slightly continues to change. So about 3% of localities in Ukraine, and here they make a difference between cities and villages and towns and smaller settlements that need to be renamed, so about 3% of the total. And of course there is regional, right? There is a regional variation here, so the majority of the towns and localities slated for renaming are located, not surprisingly, in the east and south of the country, right? So, so what about sort of the consequences that this process had in Ukraine? Here we have an interesting puzzle. On the one hand, there is quite little support for this decommunization drive in the country. There are actually, surprisingly, maybe Volodymyr or others can help me here. I wasn't able to find any nationwide opinion poll on popular attitudes to this decommunization, but there were some polls conducted in central Ukrainian cities, in particular in Poltava, in Cherkasy, and a few others that I was able to find online. And from these polls, we see that no more than a third of the population in these central Ukrainian regions fully support decommunization, and the rest basically don't. They either say it's not the time now, or they're against it altogether. On the other hand, there also were no sizable protests against this process, right? So the monuments have been toppled, Lenins have been pulled down. Sometimes locally there is some sort of smaller groups that would protest against it, but there certainly wasn't any sizable protest against decommunization. And also importantly, the parties that made it their point to openly protest decommunization laws that have submitted petitions to the Constitutional Court to declare these laws unconstitutional. Here, I mean the opposition party, the opposition bloc, the former Yanukovych associates, and the Communist Party have not capitalized in any way on their opposition to this legislation. So if we look at opinion polls for the popularity of these parties, their popularity now is less than what they even received in the last round of legislative elections last November. So they haven't really gained. So we kind of have this interesting phenomenon. On the one hand, there is little support for decommunization in society, from at least the available polls that we see. On the other hand, there is also little opposition, right? So what I am want to suggest, and that will be my conclusions for this, that there are three interrelated reasons of why that is the case. So one, and here it brings us to the issues that we already raised at the first panel, is this change in public opinion in post-Euromaidan Ukraine that both Mikhail and Volodymyr talked about, so I'm not going to repeat it. But this, the fact that there has been sort of, less positive attitudes towards kind of joint, historical, kind of Russian trajectory, right, and more patriotism, sort of patriotic feelings for Ukrainian national project, I think plays a role. I don't think it's the only explanation, but it does play a role. Another one, and this is kind of, Ukraine in a way can thank Putin for it, because the majority of actually the places where decommunization is supposed to take place, and where opposition to it, we can say most certainly would have been the highest, the process is actually not going to extend there, right? So in Crimea, in the occupied parts of Donetsk and Luhansk region, this decommunization process is not taking place. But in fact, if we actually look, just to give you one number for Luhansk, of the localities that are supposed to be renamed there, of the 54 localities to be renamed in Luhansk Oblast, only 19 are on the Ukraine-controlled part of Luhansk, and the rest are outside of Ukrainian control, right? So there isn't simply, right, kind of the polarization is avoided in part because where it would have been most polarized, it's not taking place. And finally, and I think this is also very important, I actually watched quite a few, because these town hall meetings where the renaming is being discussed many of them have been recorded and are available on YouTube. So I watched quite a few of these meetings where residents meet and decide how to rename Lenin Square and so forth. And what you see that a lot of the discourse in opposition to decommunization is not because there is particular attachment to the communist period or communist ideology, although there is some of it. But the opposition stems from this belief that there isn't really much to be gained from the process, right? So the opposition is not ideological. People are basically saying, well, the roads are not going to improve, the salaries are not going to go up, we have to spend money doing this. This is kind of dumb idea, why should we be doing this, right? But this kind of non-ideological opposition, I would argue, is less likely to motivate people to kind of organize and go protest, removal of statue of Lenin and so forth. And just finally to end, as far as policy implications, there may be some silver lining in this whole process, even if one is overall, negatively inclined towards decommunization, because it really gives a potential for the civic activism, for the society, to kind of express its opinions. So people feel, those who do feel strongly, they, get together. They can propose names for the new cities. These online forums have been set up by the city administrations and town administrations where people can propose new names for the street. People kind of begin to dig into local history. What was the street called? Is this how we want to rename it, right? So, just to end, that yes, decommunization laws have a lot of problems and many criticisms have been raised about them are warranted, but this particular concern that it will deepen societal polarization further may actually have been exaggerated, and we may not see that happening. So I'll end here.
Thank you, Oksana. And our final presenter today will be Oleksandr Sushko of the Institute for Euro-Atlantic Cooperation in Ukraine. And he will be speaking on Ukrainian reforms after the Euromaidan, content and drivers.
Thank you. So I'm not the first one to speak about changes in Ukraine this day. Certainly there is such a widely accepted formula that the key to success of Euromaidan revolution is the ability to use this momentum to transform the country. And there is another widely accepted definition that former Orange Revolution in 2004 failed not because of the quarrels between president and prime minister, but not because of the Moscow or whatever, but because of the lack of ability and will again to transform the country. And certainly there is evidence which shows us that some lessons were learned and some new elements of the picture are really visible on Ukrainian stage, which prove us that situation is different from that which we have seen 10 years ago after the Orange Revolution. At the same time, there is so the situation is still ambivalent, and the final outcome in many areas is still uncertain if Ukraine is really able to use this chance for the better future, or it will be one more wasted chance. Certainly, if you try to find the arguments in favor of either success or the failure of current momentum, you may find many of them in both, either for first or for another opinion. So there are some evident, visible examples which prove that Ukraine is changing, and on the other hand, there is lots of lacks and shortcomings which may be used as an argument for the opposite. So, first of all, when we assess the current situation, we may first of all look at the political leadership of the country. And the political leadership provides us very wide, I would say, spectrum of arguments to say that this is a kind of transitional leadership. So this is not people who are genuine reformists in a sense like they would like to portray themselves. And at the same time, they are different from that we had before, even if we compare them with Yushchenko and some other people who failed in the past. So we consider this leadership as a transitional one, which understand that they cannot survive, without certain reforms, and at the same time they represent a certain kind of operational culture which doesn't allow them to become a revolutionary reformists of the country. And this mixed operational culture is determined by different circumstances. One of the most important of them, many of you already mentioned, about the business politics connection. So this is still a big role of big business in the national politics, and the president himself came from big business, and this is not a secret, certainly. So what we call oligarchy. Another element of the picture is a constant fear of losing control in a way where post-Soviet elite usually is afraid of. So the sense of losing control doesn't allow, for example, Poroshenko and others to transform all the law enforcement and judiciary structures in a way to make them fully independent in Western sense of this meaning. So they are afraid if they really build totally independent judiciary and law enforcement structures, they may be used against themselves, and they may undermine their powers. And certainly if we look at these problems which Ukraine faces, for example, with reforms of prosecutor service, with reforms of judiciary, this kind of very, I would say, slow process of these reforms, the major reason behind is that really the political leadership is afraid of losing some control over courts, over prosecutors' office, because otherwise those new prosecutors may find them responsible for violation of certain laws, which is certainly may be found easily in the past, for example. So this is there are these internal features which make all the reform processes slowing down, especially when it comes to the vital interests of the ruling class. There are some other stories which, I would say that there are some success stories which prove that real success is possible. But again, this success is identified in the areas where which are just partially touch the nature of the administrative culture of the ruling group. For example, we have a brilliant case of the reform of the patrol police, which totally changed the perception of. It's just in Kyiv, in a few big cities. It takes 2 years more to make it in the whole country. But this is a brilliant example. But why it is succeeded? First of all, because there was a good plan, good political will, and good international assistance. And there was an idea to have very fast reform. It was possible to make it very fast. So you need to select, then train new people for 3 months, and then you may put them on the street. It is probably not possible to do the same fast, visible success in judiciary when you have to educate new judges, in prosecutor office when you need to educate new prosecutors, and certainly there is one more argument that there is no fear that this brilliant reform undermines the power of ruling group, because this undermines, this just about patrolling the streets, it is about replacement of old, very corrupt traffic police. But it is not so vital as, for example, prosecutor office, which has lots of power and which may create big problems for anybody. So this is a kind of the division line between different policy areas. In some of them we have substantial successes. In some cases we have less visible successes. The reports, we have lots of assessment reports, including the reports where I am a part of the team doing constant oversight over more than 15 policy areas of reforms, including healthcare, including education, including public administration, decentralization, anti-corruption capacity building, and the police and law enforcement and prosecutor and others. And you may see that certainly there is much more visible progress. And there are lots of things. And now what is the difference of this momentum from what we had half year ago? The half year ago we mostly were saying about adoption of the legislation. Now we rather say about new practices implementation and legal acts more and more enforced. But certainly there is a growing resistance. As far as you have a real implementation, you have a growing resistance in each area. And we see how capable to resist the system is. Now you may identify in each particular area the strongest ever possible. Sometimes it is public, sometimes it is hidden somewhere, but this is visible. And in each policy area, you have mighty structures which are working very constantly to undermine reforms through different means. This is not like a front of opposition. No, it is just hidden from different, so they just may explain you why you cannot change it through this way. Because this is illegal, because this violates the labor laws, for example, this violates the property rules and regulations and many, many things. So there are lots of arguments why you can't do any reforms. And certainly there is a risk that at certain point political leadership is either frightened or tired or not well motivated to do their job. And here we have a question, who is doing this job and who is pressing the government to do the job? And here, certainly, and my colleague already mentioned that, so in contrary to what we had 10 years ago, we have very strong and consistent will by the civil society, not just to advocate for some reforms, not just to criticize the government of not doing reforms, but to take part. And so this is a new culture, new visible culture of participation, which we never had before. We had this kind of participation only at the revolutionary moments, very short. But it will never long-lasting. Now it is really long-lasting. I have no guarantee, and nobody has a guarantee that they may continue many years ahead. But as for now, this is clear. There are lots of well-mobilized and well-organized groups in the civil society who do really great job, working with the government, working with the parliament, with some professional groups, working also to build this capacity building in different areas. And so this is a kind of hope which makes the situation really different from the past, and which gives also a chance that this moment will not be wasted. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to all the panelists for some very interesting presentations. And once again, we have a panel at PONARS that not only describes recent developments and progress toward reform and change, but also raises the larger question of how that reform or change comes about, what constrains or facilitates that change. We heard two of our panelists discuss political will. Bob Orttung talked about individual leadership as a constraint or a facilitator. Oxana talked about public attitudes as either constraining in the case of the East or facilitating as Ukraine possibly moves toward the homogeneity of attitudes that was predicted in the early days after the takeover of Crimea. And then we've heard a lot about, just now, existing organizations, big business, and administrative and institutional cultures that persist. So with that, I'd like to open it up to the audience and take the first set of questions. Okay. And yes, I'd like to remind everybody to please introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Tate Gerber, University of Wisconsin, and a PONARS member. I have two questions about Ukrainian civil society. I guess they could be addressed to Yuriy or Oleksandr or Bob, or even Oxana, even Andrew. So the first one is this. Yuriy, you appear to be calling for more support for the development of Ukrainian civil society in a very concrete way from the United States. And I just want to note that there's quite a lot of controversy over the policy. It came up in the session this morning about so-called democracy assistance and how it has been practiced by the American government in the last 20 years. And that consists of, among other things, giving money directly to NGOs to work on specific causes. The controversy is that, for example, in Russia, it seems that that strategy may have backfired in the sense that some have argued that it delegitimizes domestic NGOs when they receive this foreign funding. Now, that takes an exaggerated form with the foreign agent laws that we're familiar with, but are you concerned that if the United States were to adopt that policy and were to pour lots of money into supporting specific NGOs, that that might actually undermine the image of those NGOs in Ukrainian society as being supported by the Americans as an external fund? Is that a concern of yours? And if so, then what kinds of alternative approaches could a foreign government like the United States or like the European Union take to more effectively support the development of civil society? The second question, and I'll be brief. So from what I've read about this flourishing of NGOs and civil society in Ukraine, particularly in the last year, is that many of them have sprung up as a way to support the war effort, to support the army, to raise money for victims and displaced people. So my question is, I guess this could be for all the panelists, do you see much prospect for, let's be optimistic and hope that the war and the military conflict will diminish over time? Is there a prospect for converting that energy that has gone into, that has mobilized a lot of citizens of Ukraine to actively get involved with organizations to support the war and to deal with its consequences? Can that be converted into more sort of traditional political civil society organizations that would more effectively press the government for reform? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Well, I guess my question is also to all panelists, and it is my understanding that one of the shortcomings, major shortcomings of the current government of Ukraine, is inability or unwillingness to share even good results and achievements that have been made with the rest of the country. I think it's absolutely inexcusable, in many ways bizarre, that the Ukrainians, millions of Ukrainians, to know more about the steps in the right direction that have been actually made by this government. They would need to read articles written by some foreign experts, or listen to a panel like this one here today, or listen to Christine Lagarde when she visits Ukraine and praises achievements of this government. Why is it that you think that the PR of this government is so bad? And is there anything that we can do? Is there something that could be done to basically force these people who are in power now in Ukraine to explain to the people the logic of their actions and what they are doing, and have this bridge, this contact dialogue, constant dialogue with and contact and constant dialogue with the population? Because lots of people in Ukraine, bad rumors, they find their way. I mean, the negative information about corruption and everything persisting, that finds its way. But there have been some good things that have been done, but a lot of people in Ukraine are just not aware about that. So what could be done? Thank you.
Let's have one more question before we respond. Gentleman over here.
Good morning. Bohdan Kubzar, U.S. Army retired. What is interesting, we call about the need for reform, but I haven't heard anything mentioned about the immunity laws for the deputies, that they're immune from any prosecution. And we had the elections last year where young and idealistic people came in. So by now something should have happened, because it seems very difficult for me to understand that they still continue having the various the privileges that they have. They live in special, beautiful apartments close to Oscar's tomb, but nothing was mentioned today regarding the immunity.
Thank you. Okay, I'll ask the panelists to respond. Do you just want to go in order if you have something to... Andrew, you want to start? Okay.
Okay. Well, responding to the text questions about the possible bad image of NGOs as a grant eaters in Ukraine, and what could be done to preventing this, I think the second track, support, meaning if we not just spend money for the existing NGO, but the second track support could be education and training. Meaning we could involve more people, young people, enthusiastic people, who are already on the ground and they work there, and to give them the opportunity to learn how we can better communicate, how can we better organize themselves. And I know there are lots of initiatives in these directions is already going. So this is a good sign, and it works to be developed. And another issue is that Ukrainians are not against their NGOs, and the state and the existing government is different from the Russian one, which is treating NGOs as a foreign agent. So there is some kind of a gap between the society and the politicians. This is what Volodya was asking for, because this is a poor communication, and but there is no alienation and there is no confrontation, at least at the moment, between the politicians, the establishment, and the people on the ground. So they communicate in some ways. They could even contradict each other because the policies is not organized nicely, because there is a war and everything could happen on the ground. But there is no confrontation, I would say. So it's low chances that foreign support would undermine NGO in Ukraine. If we especially put this, what I call second track support, giving people more resources to develop. And responding to Volodya's question about this, how and why the government is poorly accepted in the society, probably that's the, well, first of all, we have to see who are these people who are in the government. And that government, probably the youngest of all existed government in Ukraine. On these three, I believe, ministers could not speak English. If we compare to the former governments, there were only few who could speak English. So we have a very good people there. But on the other hand, we have, I would not express my personal likes or dislikes for some of them as a citizen of Ukraine, but the top, I mean the prime minister, who would speak well here, or he's speaking everywhere in nice English and is giving good messages, but the problem is there. So the fish is rotten from the head, and that's the problem. And we could not just change the people on the top. Well, actually, in Ukraine, there is an initiative to make Saakashvili prime minister. And we have this new initiative when you have signed petitions to the president. If the petition will collect 25,000 signatures, it should be considered. And it is already more than 25,000 signatures, and that issue will not be escaped. And there is some tensions between Prime Minister and Saakashvili as a governor in Odessa region, because people support more Saakashvili than Prime Minister. If you look at the polls ratings, and they are very low, and the legitimacy of the existing of the Poroshenko, Yatsenyuk, and top politicians, it's very poor. So, but the legitimacy and support for grassroots activists, it's much better. So this bad image of government is that could be directed to the top of what we have. We could not just have to change these people overnight, and but we could concentrate on making them follow the rules. They don't want to follow the rules. And I will back to my original idea. In order to make them play by the rules, we have to put some binding agreements on them. And that agreements, if constitution doesn't work in Ukraine or works poorly, we have to develop some new norms, and these new norms could be integrated them to some sort of federal or confederal structure of several states. And that would be a very high stakes if you will not play by these rules, because you will undermine everything and you lose a lot. Thank you.
So unfortunately there's no easy questions here and there's no easy answers. But looking at Ted's first question about foreign funding of NGOs, I think the main problem is probably the way the government does its procurement. So it's easier for the U.S. government to hand out big chunks of money than little chunks. And so I think if you do a study of the effectiveness of NGOs in places like Ukraine and Russia, the local ones are much more effective. So it'd be much better if we gave out $5,000 or at the very local level, but that's very hard to do administratively. So, but maybe it shouldn't even be that the U.S. decides who gets the money, but give it to local groups that can then decide what's the most useful thing on the ground for them. I think that would probably be the most effective manner of doing this. But obviously some forms of aid are effective, like the police reform, which is done partly in funding. And it seems like the question that Volodya raised about the Ukrainian government's poor PR, that's something, we could send them Donald Trump. He does a good job of getting the message out of what he's accomplished, and so obviously Poroshenko hasn't been able to explain what he's doing and what success he's been making and why he does the things that he does. That's a problem also for the U.S. government. Obama doesn't do a very good job of that either. He's made a lot of accomplishments. So it's a skill that's hard to quantify and to transfer. So I'm not sure that we could, but obviously there's techniques that you could use, and that's something that I think would be a skill that could, that both sides could work on together in terms of developing. And then the second question that Ted asked about whether the success of the groups that are now helping the soldiers in the field, is that going to transfer into more sustainable NGOs over time? And I don't have any direct evidence except for my own experience working in my own neighborhood, and which is that people tend to get organized when there's a cause. So like if somebody wants to build a building in our neighborhood where people don't want the building, then everybody comes together, they work on it, they prevent it from happening, and then the group dissipates again. But what's left is those connections that people made. They all know each other's emails, they all have each other's phone numbers, that kind of thing, and they all know how to get together, and they work together on one occasion. So I think you might not see the formation of stable NGOs that are going to come out of this group, but the next time a problem comes along, whatever it is, a more economic problem or environmental problem, you have that basis that's already there. So I think that might continue on it. That's how I would think about envisioning the sustainable effects of what we see right now in terms of civil society.
Let me just very briefly add to what's already been said. On the question about what Ukrainian government can do to sort of make its case that it's actually doing something more convincing, I think that's a huge problem, and I think it's broader than just PR on the part of the government, because we see, if we look at the polls and people are asked if country is going in the right direction or in the wrong direction, you see this, that after Euromaidan there was this kind of window of opportunity when people put some faith in the new authorities, and for a few months you see people are saying country is going more in the right direction, and then it goes back down, right? So this kind of loss of trust. And I would say, I don't think it's really that there should be better PR. Better PR wouldn't help, but I don't think it would change this fundamental problem of distrust in the authorities. I think what might make a difference, if there were some big changes, right? Like big reform. And here, like investigation, mentioning of the Maidan deaths, right? The Odessa fire. If anybody from the old regime, like some big fish, would actually have consequences, right? Because if Yatsenyuk is asked, I think yes, name one official, like one senior from the old regime who was actually prosecuted for corruption, and there isn't any, right? So I think this sort of smaller scale, like yes, we reformed, like the loan system or like the banking system, like unless people see that there are these, these notorious names from the old regime are still around and not even on any list, I mean, that's the thing that people, just they throw their hands and say like, it's, it's all, the same old thing. So I think that's very important, and maybe that goes to the point that Bob was mentioning earlier about political will at the top, right? So I think that's a broader question than just PR. And just very briefly on this immunity question, I actually think, we should be careful when we advocate for immunity, because in Ukraine, immunity from persecution in the legislature historically has been some form of insurance against political persecution, right? We've seen presidents, use essentially informal mechanisms to go on the corruption charges, supposedly, but really go after political opponents, right? And I think even if we put trust in the current government that it's not going to do this, which I think, we should be careful to put our trust in them this way. There is something to be said about legislators in the country which does not have a stable functioning democracy and the rule of law and the independent court system to actually have an immunity, unless it can be proven, as was the case with Matsiyevsky, I think just yesterday or the day before, when the parliament did lift immunity, when the prosecutor was able to show video of him taking bribe and so forth, right? And now the deputy is under investigation. But my personal, take on it, that I would be careful about calling for lifting of the immunity just because of the political persecution it might lead to. So I'll just leave it at that.
First, I fully support the opinion on immunity, because in Ukraine it was widely used in the past for manipulation. And I remember some 15 years ago, Kuchma, even President Kuchma, tried to he organized a referendum even, because it was a really popular thing. But in fact, the full lifting of immunity just increases the real role of executives over those members of parliament whom they are just irritated with. So this is not, and this is for Europe. It's quite normal practice that the members of parliament have certain limited immunity, and this is normal practice. Then the question was on the perception of the NGOs and civil society actors who get funds from abroad. And certainly there is a certain question in our part of the world, but I think that paradoxically in Ukraine the domestic money are less trusted than international money. For example, if you may say that I have funds from this corporation or this business people or whatever, you will be less trusted, because it means that you follow the interest of oligarchs, business groups, and so in fact you are lobbyists of these guys. So in our case, at least now, we may see that proper managed international funds are better trusted than usually untransparent domestic money, which are also available on the market, but they are less trusted. So I think that here the key to the trust is not the source itself, either domestic or international, but the way how this money are administered. If there is a real board or independent body capable to distribute this money through transparent, accountable procedures, and if there are reports or criteria of getting money, so etc. So these elements are very important. Certainly there is a new picture of the civil society, and many new structures, new initiatives first appeared without any funds. And the new phenomena for Ukraine last couple of years is crowdfunding. Certainly that was never happened before. So there are many initiatives which are crowd-funded, and this is a certain future in this practice as well. Then is there a chance to transform the energy of those who came in order to help to survive in the war to more long sustainable initiatives? I mean that currently, yes, currently these volunteers initiatives are concentrated on support, for example, IDPs, internally displaced persons, and some other victims of the war, and there is a continuing practice of helping the army. But certainly, this is a practice for a certain time. So certainly this is not something which may last forever. And I may foresee that in a couple of years we will have not so many people involved, because this situation is extraordinary, and you never may rely on the level of involvement for extraordinary time, that it will be the same in ordinary time. But certainly there is what we may observe is that the people started to understand the value of the civic participation, again, as never before. So not as just to come to the street and protest against somebody, so that happened before many times, but to work constantly, to invest their own time, money, efforts, energy, in order to do something not connected to their ordinary work or ordinary life. So this is something which is visibly present. And how it will, certainly there is some need for international donors to look deeply through these processes, to help where there is a need to help. Because the strategy of international donors usually are planned for many years ahead. They are not flexible enough to reflect these changes. And so now there is a need for international donors also to adopt, to see that there are many new elements of the picture which may be valuable if it comes to the long term. I would say if the aim is to strengthen the capacity of the civil society to affect public policies. Then I fully agree with Volodya on communication. I'm personally involved in advising government on how to do it better. We have helped them to arrange a reform communication media center just recently, and there are some people, very enthusiastic people, professionals, who are working to translate some messages, to explain the substance of changes. Certainly it is easier when there is a consolidated approach by the government, political parties, to certain reforms. But there are many areas in which we do not have a consensus. And some groups just try to discredit and present their own position as the best and the only good one. And in this situation, it's easier. Well, it's not easy to explain the society, because society is widely manipulated. In, for example, current debates on decentralization and local governance is heavily manipulated by different incompetent or biased approaches. And there was a big problem, and there was, in my opinion, it was a mistake when we allowed from the very beginning to mix the local governance reform in Ukraine, and at the same time the Minsk II implementation. So these are absolutely different things, and unfortunately our decentralization and local governance reform, which is good enough in theory, now it is a victim of this linkage to the Minsk II. And there is again the example of how we may do better in many areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take another round of questions. Okay, first, second, third, fourth. Okay, yeah. Just start at the beginning and work back.
Oleksandr, IHS, thank you for your presentations. I have a question that some of you alluded in your remarks, both in your presentations and in your remarks. and I apologize ahead of time that it's blunt and maybe uncomfortable. I mean, there is a somewhat growing perception on the outside that the root of corruption problems within the state institutions of Ukraine, within the government, has to do with Prime Minister Yatsenyuk. I mean, Saakashvili himself alluded to this more or less. So my question to you is, what do you see happening going forward to address this challenge? And actually, I want to bring an example of Sasha Baravik, who resigned in May, and in his parting remarks, he also alluded to this problem. So, I mean, this is at the crux of the issue and the topic of this panel in particular. So, I would very much appreciate your feedback. Thank you.
I have a comment on Oksana's presentation on decommunization. I very much appreciate that your focus was on these fears of deepening societal divisions and how they might be unwarranted. I want to add two remarks on why it's not so dangerous in this respect. First is that you mentioned changing public opinion. The very idea that decommunization will inevitably produce antagonism in the East and South was based on this essentialized vision of Ukraine as inherently divided, and this divide was considered to be permanent and unchangeable, which is of course very wrong, which of course underestimate the development, the change that took place during 2 decades of independence, how these institutions, including education and the media and the very practice of belonging to this state, might change this attitude. And so, except in the Donbass, in this, what I call East/South, there is not predominant support, but a lot of support for that. And second, in addition to this non-ideological nature of the opposition, what Oksana mentioned, an important issue is that many people are opposed to the manner in which these changes are conducted, for example, Lenin Opad. In my focus groups, I asked, what do you think of that in your respective city? What do you think of this removal of Lenin? And some people started by saying, of course, it's barbarism, because that was not planned, orderly, legitimate in terms of being ordered by the authorities. Yeah, but it was conducted violently by a group of enthusiasts. But on the other hand, people say, yes, of course, he didn't belong here. He has no relation to this particular city. Of course, it's better not to have him here standing as he was standing for decades. And they were of different opinion what should be next. Some say, of course, flowers. Some say, of course, a national hero belonging to this region. But the very fact that they are so widely divided on what should happen next means that they cannot unite in opposition toward removal of Lenin and suggesting Lenin should be reinstated. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Katie Fox from the National Democratic Institute. My question is, I think, mainly for Oleksandr, but others as well. You spoke about, I think, the heart of the matter, which is the entrenched, sort of behind-the-scenes opposition to reforms, or people who make the very reasonable excuse that it's illegal or it's against labor law or whatever. So my question is, has anything that's happened to date since the Revolution of Dignity provided a clue, a roadmap about how to get around that? I'm thinking that perhaps the reform of the patrol police is not completely relevant because it's big economic interests are not hurt in the reform of the patrol police. Maybe I'm wrong, it seems to me. Perhaps in the reform of the energy sector. So any thoughts on how lessons that have been learned or other ways to attack that entrenched resistance?
Hi, Mikhail Alexeyev, San Diego State and PONARS. Oleksandr started the issue on decentralization, and I wanted to ask more panelists to comment on it, perhaps maybe more Oxana and Yuriy on the potential effects of that. I mean, it was passed in the first reading, right? And I guess it's pretty much going to become law. So we saw some protest in Kyiv about it, which turned violent. In a way, of course, you know, it wasn't. It was a tragic development in some ways. On the other hand, you can think, well, more could have happened. More nasty things could have happened. More protests of that nature could have happened. So, could it be potentially divisive, destabilizing if it actually goes through, and to what extent, how it may be handled?
Thank you. Okay, I'd like to ask the panelists to respond.
Thank you. I wanted to say thank you to the audience members for your interesting questions and the panelists for their presentations and answers, which have been helpful to me already. So my goal in my presentation here was to try to suggest there might be a new way, different way, better, more effective way to think about what it means to combat oligarchy and to combat corruption. And I've heard a number of examples of frustration of people who have been prosecuted for corruption, and people are still engaged in it, and we don't know if Yuriy is really still engaged in all these sorts of things. I don't deny any of those things are occurring. I certainly don't argue that any particular individual whom you raise to me is free of corruption or oligarchic ties. My concern is that trying to pursue them all will be destructive, right? What we're seeing, or what I feel a little bit, is sort of a fragmentation of commitment to the original revolution, because you sort of feel like somebody else isn't as committed as they ought to be, right? We need to hive off the people who haven't pursued the reforms as deeply as they ought to. Maybe to put it a little bit more bluntly than maybe I should. And I think that's dangerous, right? Because you can obviously hive off people until you're the only one left. We see that happen with revolution after revolution after revolution. And it seems from world history, world economic history, that actually sort of the best outcome we've figured out to get with regard to oligarchs is to make them sort of less explicit and less violent about the way they take and protect property. If they can outsource that to the government, then maybe that's okay, rather than taking it on themselves. I think that would be obviously a huge move for Ukraine. And the best we've seemed to be able to do with corruption is to funnel it into directions that facilitate production. They just become costs of production, right? If you know whom you have to bribe to move the process along, that's a whole lot better than sort of every bureaucrat you encounter taking more money. Because in that second case, you don't have any left, right? It really, really discourages investment, to say the least. And so I would like us to be able to think about ways to transform both the sort of the oligarchic system and the corruption in Ukraine in ways that are at least less painful than they've been in the past. And in so doing, maybe we won't make worse problems by trying to sort of clean it all up in an impossible task.
Well, the question about the roots of corruption was here, and we have to differentiate between the systemic and the high-level political corruption and the random occasions of people interacting with the doctors, with the officials, and etc. So, but the corruption is, as the institute, is the cornerstone of the system that we still have in Ukraine, and the revolution of dignity hasn't changed much in that respect. On the one hand, we have a big demand on to the system to be clean, and the people on the ground are trying to behave differently. The young people, they are against this sort of things because it's against the dignity of the young people. But those who are older, this is just a routine practices. But so there is no magic, there is no some brilliant solution. How can we have a clean system overnight? It's a long process, and we have to move forward with transparency, accountability, and control, and rotation of the people. Meaning, we could not have elections every other week or every other year. And we cannot just put and brought some people here on the government. That takes time. And, but the process is going on. So the demand, the societal demand, and the pressure from outside will create conditions that corruption will be limited. This is my feeling is. Of course, as Oleksandr also already told us, the resistance is strong, because most people who are in between the high top politicians and the businesses, these intermediaries, so they are involved in these things. In Parliament, for example, we have some, this is my personal count, some 60, 70 deputies who are reform-driven and who represent some different values, who are trying to push for reforms. But the majority of this new elected parliament, which renewed on 60% more, are strongly connected with oligarchs. Well, the one very dramatic signals came recently from one German expert who works for a German bank, and it was the example. He revealed the facts that he knew that high state politicians were sold the places in their party list, and these two were Poroshenko and Yatsenyuk. So this is the scandalous news that shows how this high-level politics is worked. But on the other side, the society has a big demand for major cleanup. So we have to concentrate on the people on the ground, on the NGOs, on the local leaders, and make those who are in the power in the conditions that when they move out of some limits, when they violate the constitution, but it's trivial to say follow the rules, but the control and the support of the people will create conditions when the corruption could be diminished. This is my feeling.
I just want to make a few comments to answer the first question on Yatsenyuk. I think part of the problem is, of course, that they don't want to repeat the show that we saw with Tymoshenko and Yushchenko, that you have this constant battle between the prime minister and the president. But the bigger problem is, of course, the funding of the oligarchs into the system, and that's sort of what people are accusing Yatsenyuk of representing. So I think the key there, and obviously there's no easy solution, but it would be some sort of campaign finance reform, because we already saw the election that took place in the summer in July, you know, 2 different oligarchs won the president, funding 2 different candidates, and that having a huge impact and creating a huge amount of public disgust with the electoral system. And then you have the elections coming up in October, so there's going to be even more evidence of oligarch funding of different political parties and different candidates at the regional level, just as they do in the parliamentary level. So, you know, one area to focus on would be to have real campaign finance reform. You know, that's obviously ridiculous to sit in the United States and advise other countries that you need campaign finance reform, because obviously in our country it doesn't work at all either. But you know, that would be one thing to focus on. You know, it's a clear, obvious task that would bring more transparency to what's going on at the parliament and what's going on in the regional elections as well. And I think that's where you can bring public pressure to bear, because obviously the politicians themselves don't want this reform because they don't want to show what's going on, just as the politicians here in this country don't want to show what's going on. But you can mobilize public pressure to force the politicians to change, and that's what's going to have to happen in this country. That's what's going to have to happen in Ukraine.
Let me also briefly comment on the first question about the Yatsenyuk and corruption, and then on decentralization that Misha mentioned. I think with the Yatsenyuk allegations, I think it raises again this question of the public trust, right? Because there is, of course, this argument how, you know, when you mentioned Saakashvili, that corruption is in the Yatsenyuk. But it's not very easy to open any kind of, you know, issue of a local newspaper and find some story how it's actually Poroshenko who is corrupt. I mean, just like off the top of my head, I think it was a couple of days ago in the Mariupol, they claims that he sold essentially the post of the mayor to Akhmetov person, right? And that was the allegations by the Poroshenko, the former Poroshenko party chief in that region who got sacked, and he claims that he got sacked because he opposed that sort of thing, right? So if even for those of us who follow Ukrainian politics closely, it is very difficult to say where the truth is actually. I mean, is one a slander and the other one is true? Are they both true, right? And then when people read this, they basically just saying we can't trust any of them and it's back to the business as usual, right? And this is why, exactly, I think the question was raised earlier, why there is no public, people don't believe that the reforms are happening, even though experts can name areas where reforms are happening. Now, the question is what is to be done about it, and here I want to suggest a pretty radical thing that again was actually in the news recently. I think it was Guatemala that outsourced its corruption persecution to some international body, right? Maybe Ukraine should consider doing that. I mean, I don't know, whoever is in Ukraine is a genuine reformer. I mean, that would be one sign to say okay, if public distrusts all of our security apparatus, that there are these mutual allegations of corruption, to avoid exactly that Yushchenko, Tymoshenko kind of, war of all against all, let's have some international body that can actually be trusted, and let's have them prosecute at least these big cases, right? Let them investigate, the Maidan, let them, prosecute allegations of corruption, at least at the top levels of government. From what I can tell, nobody in Ukraine really has an appetite for this, to actually do this. But I think the fear that the reforms is going to be the repeat of some form of a repeat of what happened after the Orange Revolution, when there is this sort of original enthusiasm and something gets done, but then public trust is not there, and the mutual allegations keep flying, and the whole thing disintegrates. I think it's quite real. I mean, I wouldn't be as pessimistic to say it's inevitable, but I think it's definitely something to be concerned about. Now, on decentralization, Misha, I think, you're right, of course, on the one hand, there is a support in society for decentralization, not federalization, but decentralization. And then there was, of course, this attempt to push through this constitutional reform resulted in this violent confrontation in front of the parliament. I think what we need to keep in mind when we think of decentralization, a lot of attention has been paid, and that's what the protests were about, as to what this constitutional reform on decentralization means for the status of the Donbas region in Ukraine. But decentralization is much broader than that, right? And one of the key elements of decentralization is the question whether indeed presidential powers, the executive powers, are being reduced, and the powers, of local authorities, in the regions, the councils and so forth, are being strengthened. And I think that still remains an open question. From what I remember, I'm not going to quote any specific article, but there are some legitimate concerns that both the NGOs have expressed, and at least some of the political parties, that the way at least some versions of this draft constitutional reform actually strengthen presidential powers, and would make it more difficult, that even that Yanukovych didn't have, the kind of powers that president might get, if the version of the constitutional reform that he favors would be passed. So, as we consider this question, I think it would be useful, at least for the experts, to not just focus on does it mean that Donetsk is going to be de facto separate or not, which actually I don't think it will be, because essentially constitutional reform kind of brackets that status of Donetsk and Luhansk to a separate law, and then the parliament could adopt this law in many different ways. So I think the real systemic issue that this constitutional reform and decentralization would address is what is the balance of power between center and the regions and the executive authority. And the other forms of authority, and I think that's something that is still not quite fully resolved and may take different shapes.
So, let me discuss a little bit with Oxana, because the substance of the decentralization reform, in my opinion, is different. The substance is either we're capable to build fundamentals of the proper functional democracy at the level of local communities. And this is, so the very substance is empowering local communities to become real lowest unit of democracy. So because before all the debates were about the distribution of power between president, prime minister, president and regional administrations or the regional councils, but it has never been before about this substance. So what was behind from the very beginning of the decentralization reform modalities was the idea to empower local communities. And the law which was adopted in March on the voluntary amalgamation of local communities was a first and very substantial step towards this modality. It provided the option, not mandatory, but voluntary option for local communities to upgrade their state, their administrative structure, and then to get additional power, including budget power, including management over local infrastructure, including healthcare, education, etc. And finally, to build the whole new structure from bottom-up principle. So that was the very idea of that. And certainly this law was a good step. Finally, we have at this moment 7% of local communities already used this option. And so we will have at the local elections of October 25, we will have a mixed model, in fact, because 93 territories will operate within the previously existent model, and 7% already use the new model. So this is a transitional period, and there are continuous debate. Either we need to leave it as voluntary or then to proceed to mandatory change of the regional structure. Certainly, it will unlikely work within all the territory only on voluntary basis. At certain point, you need to impose something. But certainly, this is the problem appeared first when at this level, when presidential administration and political parties started to bargain on who is the chief, who has more power, etc., who has to control. And certainly, president has a rationale behind his position. His position is about that if the local council or the local mayor violates constitution and law, so president or some authorities on the national level may suspend his or her authority, or even to dissolve the local council if it doesn't comply with the constitution. This is a normal practice. So again, there are debates on what is the role of judiciary and who is applied to the courts. So there are lots of very technical and political issues, certainly. But there is nothing about the conflictual potential. So all these things could be debated through the expert debate, through political debate, but everything has been changed as soon as the Minsk agreement was, I would say, some way imposed on that. So it was some way became a part of this thing, because in fact, the problem of political solution in the East is not about the local community's power, definitely. So this is about something different. Okay, there are some common terminology may be used, but by substance, this is absolutely different problem, because on one hand, you have a need to empower local communities to build normal democracy. On the other hand, you need to satisfy Moscow. Is it the same thing? Yeah, I think this is a totally different things. So, and the problem, and here we have a continuation of this problem, that we have at the same time follow the reform, and at the same time we need to satisfy Moscow. In my opinion, there will be big problem in this parliament to get 300 votes in the second reading for this draft because of the controversy with this article, with this one single article. Especially taking into account that separatists are likely to conduct their own quasi-elections in October. So here, again, there is a big question for the West, by the way, either to insist on that Ukraine has to adopt this regulation regardless what's going on with separatists, or in some way should be more flexible approach should be applied. But in my opinion, the biggest challenge now is how to decouple two problems. One of them is decentralization and local governance model for Ukraine, and another one, Minsk agreement implementation. So there are all very important things, but different. How to decouple it now, I don't know, because we all went too far, and now all this so much connected. So there is a challenge for big actors how to deal with that.
Well, it's 1 o'clock, so we have to wrap up. Are there any final questions for the panel very quickly? Okay, if you could be brief.
Hi, I'm Catherine Fitzpatrick, the interpreter. I understand what you're saying about the decoupling, but the reality is, if you don't have control of the border, which is what Minsk II is supposed to give back to Ukraine and has not yet done, decentralization is really just occupation in some parts. This is a large chunk of the border. It's about 475 kilometers. So without that, decentralization seems to me, especially in that region, would be extremely vulnerable.
Let me just respond. Yes, but why 95% of the territory of Ukraine should be a hostage of this kind of the situation? Yes, there is a long problem, I mean, with Donbass, and we have no illusions that it will be solved this year or even next year. So, but why we should some way block substantial reforms of local governance in the entire Ukrainian territory when we are speaking about the Donbass solution? I think that the model for the whole Ukraine should start working regardless of the time, the date when we start controlling the border at the separatist controlled territories.
Okay. I'd like to thank everybody for attending, and I'd like to thank the panelists for some very interesting papers and comments.